Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, a podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 46, and today we're asking, was Jesus born in a stable? In last year's Christmas episode of the NT Pod, I asked the broader historical question about Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. And in today's episode, I want to focus on one of the details in the text that we think we know, the question of whether or not Jesus was born in a stable. I mean, if you're even vaguely familiar with the Christmas story, through whatever means it is, through nativity plays or through Christmas cards or through advent calendars, whatever the means is, you'll know that Mary and Joseph come down from Nazareth to Bethlehem to take part in a census. Mary is heavily pregnant. They need somewhere to stay. They go and approach the innkeeper. The innkeeper tells them that there's no room in the inn, and therefore they stay in the stable, perhaps that's connected to the inn, something like that. And Jesus is born, he's laid in a manger, and shepherds from the fields abiding come and worship him at that manger. And then wise men from the east come and join them too. You often see the scene with the star over the top of the stable and the wise men and the shepherds and the animals all there together. It's a wonderful and romantic scene. I mean, when we turn, though, to the actual specifics of the story, the first text that we have that really clearly locates where Jesus is a 2nd century text called the Protevangelium of James. Protevangelium means something like pre-gospel. It's a prequel to the Gospels. And what the Protevangelium of James is doing is it's trying to tell you lots of the details about Mary, Joseph, and the birth of Jesus that aren't told in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which are the Gospels in the New Testament that have birth narratives in there. Protevangelium of James is probably late 2nd century and has very little historical value, if any. But it's very interesting when it comes to the question of Jesus' birth because it's located in a cave. And that for many is quite an interesting way of reimagining Jesus' birth, to see it taking place in a cave. It's a remarkable story, and perhaps one future NT pod will have to dwell in a bit more detail on the Protevangelium of James and its picture of Jesus having his birth in that cave. What I think is interesting about that Protevangelium of James text is that at least one very early reader of the Gospels didn't think that Jesus was born in a stable. And so does the text say that Jesus was born in a stable? Well, let's take a look first of all at Matthew's Gospel. In Matthew's Gospel, it seems that they're in a house. Matthew 2:11, the Magi who have come from the east, the Magi find Mary and Jesus in the house. I mean, later tradition in trying to harmonise this with Luke's account say that perhaps the Magi arrived a bit later when Mary and Joseph have moved to a house or something like that, but there's no indication of that in Matthew's narrative. So no stable in Matthew. What about Luke then? Well, the key verse in Luke's Gospel is Luke 2:7. This is it in the New Revised Standard Version. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. I actually don't like that translation, bands of cloth, very much. I was brought up with swaddling clothes, and it was always rather striking to my ear because I come from near to a small town in Derbyshire called Swaddling Coat, and whenever this swaddling clothes was read out at school, it was like, whoa, is our local town in the Bible? And the teachers were always keen to tell us it's nothing to do with Swaddling Coat, something which I was always rather sceptical about. But anyway, bands of cloth, they wrap him in and they lie him in a manger because the text says there was no place for them in the inn. Now, the story which is created on the basis of this verse, of there being no room in the inn and of putting Jesus in the manger, is that by implication, Mary and Joseph are in a stable, which is where you'd find a manger around with lots of animals and so on. But there is a problem with this reading, and it's the word that's translated there, inn, because the word for inn in Greek is kataluma, and the word kataluma really is rather a general word, which means something like living quarters, accommodation, room, place to stay, something like that. It's not as precise as the translation inn suggests. There's been a recent article on this by Stephen Carlson in New Testament Studies, and he points out that the term kataluma really means not inn And Luke has another word for inn anyway. He has the word pandokion, which he uses in Luke 10:34 in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So there you really have got an inn. And Colson suggests in that article that we don't have a picture of an inn and a stable. And in fact, if you translate it as it should be something like place to stay, what's being said is that they laid Jesus in the manger because there was no room for them in their place to stay. Now, their place to stay here would therefore be Mary and Joseph's married accommodation. The picture is probably something like this, that Joseph is thought to be from this area, from Bethlehem. Luke, after all, does describe it as his own city. And they have gone to Bethlehem from Nazareth. Joseph has gone pick Mary up, if you like, and bring her to Nazareth, and that's where they're getting married. And they move into this marital accommodation, which is perhaps a room tacked on to the main family dwelling place. And the idea is that perhaps this marital accommodation is so small, it's so cramped, that there isn't room for Mary to give birth and place Jesus somewhere at that point of birth. What's happening is that you've got a very sort of cramped place, so where they go is into the main room. Now, we might say, main room? What's going on? Why have they got a manger sticking about in the main room? I find it incredibly difficult to imagine this house with animals within, striking distance of the family, and imagine the smells and the sounds and all the rest of it, and how on earth you'd sleep at night. But apparently, the archaeologists and the experts on this tell us that houses in the Middle East in this period would have had a kind of two-step sort of main room, and you would have the animals being brought into that other room at night, so you would have mangers present in this big main room. So what's happening is Jesus is getting put in the manger in this main room, and that's the place where the shepherds then come and find Jesus. So manger is there, but stable isn't. Luke doesn't have this stable, and he doesn't have an inn. Those are things that we import into the story because of slight mistranslations and slight recontextualizations and so on. Well, if that reading is right, and if we don't have an inn in Luke's narrative, then we do have to do a little bit of rethinking of the whole business of where Mary and Joseph come from. We have in Luke's Gospel this idea of Mary at the very least being from Nazareth, and Joseph does seem to be there too and to travel to Bethlehem. Is it that he, in Luke's imagination and in Luke's writing, originally comes from Bethlehem, and that he goes and meets Mary in Nazareth and brings her to his family home and then subsequently settles in her area? That might be what's implied in the background of Luke's narrative. And it's interesting if that's the case, that certainly in Matthew's Gospel there's no mention of Nazareth right until the end of that birth narrative, at the end of chapter 2, as if Joseph's abode is Bethlehem, right there at the beginning of chapter 2, and then subsequently they move up together to Nazareth. But it has to be said, it is odd. It's strange reading the Lucan narrative and trying to work out exactly what the logistics of this thing are. One thing, though, that I think makes it highly likely that we have got some kind of married accommodation for Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem in Luke's narrative is that when they subsequently go to make their purification in the temple, their offering for Mary's purification in the temple, later in Luke chapter 2, they seem to be doing this from Bethlehem. So they've clearly not been staying in an inn for the best part of a month, because you have to wait 40 days to make that purification. So they've been living somewhere all of this time, and not presumably in the inn, because there isn't one. And what we have is a place to stay instead. Now, of course, there's a degree of disappointment to this, because our imaginations really have that image of the stable, of the innkeeper, so firmly embedded in our thinking. I played a little clip from one of my favourite children's nativity songs at the beginning, where you have them knocking at the door, trying to find a place to stay. And, thinking about those nativity plays, it's difficult to remove those sorts of images from your mind. I have anxious memories about being involved in nativity plays myself, and very happy memories of watching my kids involved in nativity plays. And those images probably aren't going to vanish, and the Christmas cards are still going to have the shepherds and the wise men gathering around a stable with a star over it. And I must admit that I'm rather attached to that image myself, however strong the exegesis is that tells us that the reality in Luke Luke's gospel was probably something a little bit different. And in talking about all these things, I'm reminded to say to all my listeners a very happy Christmas. And of course, if you're in the US, that translates to a very happy holidays. And I look forward to having your company in 2011. You can always find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, over on Facebook at ntpod, on Twitter at ntpod2. And thanks again for listening and for being with me in 2010.
He sent Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem to have his son, and thereby to start the Christian faith.
Why do you think that God with all his pull? I mean, he'd have found him a better place to stay than a stable.
Well, there wasn't no room at the inn that night.
Oh, it was Christmas. Everywhere's crowded at Christmas.
Silly